Us started. I'm going to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. I'm Tracy Adedeji. I'm the current president of the Rhode Island CPCU chapter. I am extremely excited to have with us today Precious Norman-Walton. Precious is past president of the Dallas CPCU chapter. Um, she's my friend. um, just an amazing, talented sales and risk management professional. I'm actually going to turn the floor over to her now and let her talk to you a little bit. Introduce herself as she'd like to be introduced before she dives into the presentation. So, Precious, welcome and thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This is amazing. And yes, I have the highest respect for Tracy. So anywhere she invites me, I'm there. So as you guys heard, that's soon to be in person in Rhode Island. So that'll be super fun. So yeah, I'm the immediate past president for the Dallas chapter of the CPCU Society. I have recently gone into full-time entrepreneurship. So I'm an agency owner now. So Lovejoy Risk Management Corp is the agency that I've launched, and we specialize in transportation and trucking risks. So the big rigs, the big wheels, the stuff that everyone else runs away from. is really where they need so much help. So that's what I've decided to dedicate my practice to. So this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart in terms of ethical behavior within the agent and broker environment. It is such a vital conversation. Of course, March is Ethics Awareness Month, so it's very timely that we have this conversation now. With the presentation that I put together for today, it's intended to be very interactive. So I'm going to, open it up for, responses, feedback, questions. So, the tone is to be very casual and interactive. The more that we can facilitate a conversation around the presentation, the better it is for all involved. So I have the chat feature open. I don't know if you guys are more comfortable typing questions or just kind of jump in there, whatever the more convenient method of doing that is. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. So let me share my presentation here and we'll get going. Bear with me just a second here. Awesome. So hopefully you guys can see my presentation here on screen. So again, this is ethical behavior in the agent and broker environment presented by myself. As you see, there's a whole string of alphabet soup here that follows my name. And, of course, everyone, is familiar with CPCU. Most of the designations and certifications that I've gained are within the insurance space. But one thing that I do want to call out, which is why this is really, a subject that is close to me, is I've recently obtained my SHRM certification. So if you're not aware, that is an HR certification. So I'm a certified professional in human resources. And so, the intersection of CPCU and human resources is so important because it really speaks to, creating a culture for ethics. Ethics is definitely something that is top down. If your upper leadership embraces it and prioritizes it, then the rest of the organization adapts it. But if it becomes lip service, which sometimes we do, we pull it out in March, put it away for the other 11 months, then it just becomes, again, something that's really not embraced or viewed as necessary. So we'll go ahead and jump into Tracy did an amazing job of introducing me. So this is a flyer that I think it was available when you registered for the course today, but it just kind of describes me in a nutshell that I'm as much risk management human resources as I am insurance, because I really feel like when you combine those two, it just makes for a better experience for those of us who work within the industry and also attempting to lift the reputation and the impression that the general public has about what an insurance professional is all about. So this is kind of my one pager. I list my superpowers because we all have them, right? And so I think it's really important to be able to articulate them and call them out. So I am a connector of people, a builder of people, very pro professional development. And again, the more that we know, the better asset we become for the clients that we serve and the organizations that we represent. So today's discussion is all about the necessity of ethics within this environment. So just so I can get a feel of who's on, are any of you guys on the call today working within an agent or broker environment right now? And we've got a cozy crowd, so feel free to yes, no, maybe.
So, Precious, I work on the kind of on the carrier side. So, although I'm not working as an agent or broker, I do interface with them on a daily basis.
Very cool. And we'll actually touch on that piece of the relationship here in a little bit as well. Any other agents, brokers in the house? Okay, we'll keep moving.
So, Catherine says that she works on the claims side.
Got it. Okay. Yep. And there's a lot to be said there, in terms of just the trust factor, which is really why ethics is so necessary in what we do. So before I do a deeper dive into the presentation itself, I did want to share with you just kind of a recent experience that I had on the other side of the desk, right? So as an insurance professional for the last 15 years or so. I've worked as a underwriter. I currently again work in the agent broker space. I still maintain an all risk adjusters license here in the state of Texas. So I've kind of rounded the bases and did a little bit of everything that can be done in our industry from the traditional roles. Um, Being here in the Dallas, Texas area, of course, if you have access to the news, you're no stranger to the fact that we just recently went through a really brutal winter storm. Brutal, not just because we're Southerners and we're not accustomed to the cold, but because our infrastructure was not prepared for these events. So I was one of the households that was affected by a frozen pipe that burst. Not only did the pipe burst, but it completely inundated our home. We had actually went to spend the night at a relative's house because the temperature inside of our home was so uncomfortable. And we came home to about 6 inches of standing water throughout the house. It was approximately 4 days before we were able to get water extraction services into the home. And at that point, as you can imagine, our personal belongings sat in standing water for 4 days, which meant that the loss, we basically lost about 75% of everything we owned. And had the unpleasant realization that even though insurance is what I do all day, every day, we were underinsured. It had been a while since I revisited our policies, and you know how that goes. Life happens, birthdays, Christmas, Black Friday, you upgrade, you replace, and before you know it, you've added so much to what you own, and calling the insurance company is not really high priority in what we do when we're living our life day to day. So it was really humbling to be on the caller end of, contacting first notice of loss. Kudos to the first representative that I spoke to. I mean, the user experience was everything you would want out of that first notice of loss contact. She was empathetic. She was thorough. She walked me through expectations, talked about next steps. We were able to, she gave me an advance on things when she understood how big of a loss, the scope of the loss was going to be. And so for that, of course, that just fills you with a sense of pride. Like, this is what we do. This is what it's all about, preparing people to make wise decisions. So when they do inevitably encounter the need for the coverage, they feel good about the decisions that were made and who they did business with. The rest of the claims experience, however, left a lot to be desired. There were some gaps where I try not to be that customer that shows up and says, "Oh, I know all about how you're supposed to do your job. Let me, tell you the things that aren't going well." But one of the things that I tell anyone who's entering our industry is that getting into property and casualty not only made me a better professional, but it also made me a more informed consumer. And so, since I understand the process and I understand the product, I was able to advocate better for my family. I could speak up and I could say, "Hey, under the additional living expenses, I have receipts. Who do I send that to? Can we revisit, the depreciation? Can we, so I was able to, again, walk through these steps. Now, of course, as an insider of sorts, I have the ability to do that, right? I can flash the ID and say, hey, part of the club. So, can you treat me accordingly? But the reality of it is that the everyday insured that we interact with has that right to be treated in such a way where it's not predicated on their understanding of the process. We have fair dealings, is what this whole industry is based on. Because when we don't have that transparency and that clarity, then they start to lose confidence. And when consumer confidence drops, we all understand it's just not good for the business. So I wanted to share that with you because it was obviously very humbling to be on the other end of it. And it's so easy in the day to day course of our jobs to start looking at settlements, deck pages, submissions as just pieces of paper that we handle and forget about the human factor. So I wanted to share that with you. So as I walk through ethics, ethical behavior, we'll talk a little bit about real life examples to kind of tie it all together and make this actionable, and relevant to what we do today. So the learning objectives for this presentation are defining the terms. There are some terms that are out there that are related but not identical to ethics. And so we'll go ahead and tackle that and talk about that a little bit. Um, Challenges and temptations. Ethics isn't always easy. If it were, we wouldn't have to revisit it on a regular basis. So we'll talk about scenarios that sometimes, again, lead to the temptation of, cutting a corner or seeking out the easier route, which again is not in line with how this is designed to work. We'll discuss a little bit about who the stakeholders are, what these critical relationships look like, and then, of course, again, creating that culture for ethics, creating a culture because it's so much easier to engage in ethical behavior when you know that that is part of the identity and value proposition of the organization you represent. When you know that you and your coworkers and everyone else all hold ethical behavior in a positive light and don't look at it as a burden, then again, the trickle down effect, the entire organization embraces the concept of behaving ethically. Any questions, concerns about what we're about to get into at this point? We're all good? All right, let's do it. So I started to add another slide. I guess I'll just throw this in here more conversationally again. Um, a the year that I became a CPCU, I did not go to my own conferment. I was transitioning between employers at the time. And so I ended up leaving the company that I'd worked for a good amount of time during the summer. And so I was a brand new employee by the time the fall came around. And it was 2016, so I missed Hawaii. Which that's okay because I didn't get into it for the Hawaii trip, even though that would have been stellar. But in exchange, that following year, my new employer recognized the importance of the accomplishment, and they gave me a very generous gift card. And it also correlated with my husband's 40th birthday, I believe it was. And so we took that opportunity to go on our very first cruise. So went down to Galveston. I'd never stepped foot on a boat ever, didn't know what to expect. So as you're going through all the motions, I was shocked and caught off guard when they called for the muster drill, right? And so in the past, again, when you're younger and you don't have much context, when I heard people say things like it has to pass muster, I heard mustard, like the condiment. Right. And I'm like, that is a really weird statement. Why do you pass the mustard, pass the ketchup? I don't know what's happening here. But the mustard drill is when everyone on the ship, and again, it's something that's required with maritime safety and law. You go down and you line up to where like the emergency, ships are. So it feels very Titanic-ish, right, at this moment, because it's really important that every passenger knows where to be, how it works, how to board in an orderly fashion. And this drill must take place before the ship sails. And it's not a come if you want to learn more, but everyone has to be present in order for this to happen. So I bring up the concept of muster because as we talk about ethics, a lot of it is really going to come down to that internal litmus test, right? Does this situation, does this decision pass muster? So we're going to go ahead and kind of jump into definitions. So I took some literal screenshots from dictionary.com because I felt like that was a very neutral base in terms of, explaining concepts and definitions. So one related word when we talk about ethics is legal, because there are some that kind of hold to the legality of a situation to determine whether or not it is acceptable or permissible. So the definition of legal, straight out of dictionary.com, is something that is permitted by law. The opposite of permitted by law is illegal, right? And so we understand that illegal activities are crimes because they're against the law, and those are things that are punishable by the legal system. Well, as we're all aware, there are absolutely things that can happen within an agent broker environment that are just flat out illegal. Stealing, fraud, these sort of crimes that not only result in maybe the revocation of your license, but you can go to jail. Laws are laws and they apply inside and outside of the professional context. So again, the letter of the law is different than the spirit of the law. The law is not going to explicitly, mandate how you spend every moment of the day, click by click, transaction by transaction. So again, this is kind of the baseline for which, behavior is dictated, because the minimum expectation is that we behave in a way that is legal. And again, that's enforceable by the legal system should we violate things that are part of the law. Any questions or feedback as far as the definition of legal? We're good? All right. So moral, it starts to get a little bit beyond legal. Okay. And so again, here's the dictionary.com definition of moral. And so moral is a set of rules or principles. It's the distinction between right and wrong. And even in the dictionary.com definitions of things, you'll see that they mince terms a little bit. So in the first explanation, the first definition rather, you see they have the word ethical tied into there, which is part of what leads to the confusion of where do the lines exist and where is there overlap between one and the other. So morals, for the most part, are derived from philosophy, from religion. So there's things that, that are very faith specific, from various cultures. Morals may not necessarily, if you do something that is immoral, it is not always illegal. It's just not the acceptable norm according to whatever moral compass that you utilize to kind of figure out, right and wrong behavior. So again, the concern with morality is that morality is very subjective. It depends on who you speak with. So now, again, I'm down here in Dallas, Texas. I'm a Louisiana girl. Mardi Gras is over. And so we're officially in Lent. It's Lenten season. And so there are a lot of behaviors that, statewide or more specifically within, certain religious denominations are observing Lenten, and there's certain things that they don't do. Whereas if that's not something that you practice or observe, you may still behave in these activities. And so that's an example again of how morality is subjective and can be really difficult to enforce or interpret, because it's based on some sort of inner code that oftentimes has roots again in philosophy or religion or kind of the prevailing behaviors. So lastly, we get into ethics, which is really what we've come together to discuss today. And ethical behavior, the one piece of the definition I really wanted to pull out comes from the second bullet point, which is the standards of a profession. So the standards of the profession is really kind of the prevailing thought process here. What is typical? What is understood? What is commonplace for those of us that operate within the agent broker structure? So the opposite again of ethical is unethical. Unethical is not necessarily immoral and it's not necessarily illegal. Unethical means that it breaks with whatever the standards are for our profession. So even within the CPCU society, we have a document that guides and gives us guidance on acceptable ethical behavior. And that's the canons, rules, and guidelines for the CPCU, the code of conduct. So this is a document that actually articulates a little bit how do you apply this measure when you're facing certain um, examples, right? And so this is kind of precedent setting, if you will. So ethical, again, is really, it goes to, for example, I think bullet point 3 on the definition talks about, it cuts off a little bit here. The ethical as it pertains to prescriptions are drugs that are deemed to be necessary, right? And so that's something that's come up in the news here in the recent couple of years is the overprescribing and, prescribing things that are unnecessary, and does that, specifically as it pertains to medical practitioners, is that ethical behavior. It may not be illegal because they have the prescription pad, they are the professional, right? And so it is their discretion on how, they utilize this tool, but the ethics of it, is this really a decision that's in the best interest of, the patient or whoever's impacted by the decision. So when it comes to the measure, again, going back and looking at why is ethics something that is so difficult to, why is this such a hard pill to swallow? What makes it hard? In the agent and broker environment, the biggest piece of that is typically monetary motivation. Ethics is not convenient. There are situations where taking the ethical, high road may result in a fiscal impact. So, case in point, I mentioned to you, in the onset that I specialize in the trucking and transportation space. So, I was contacted by a prospect earlier this week, and the gentleman was 21 years old, so relatively young when it comes to driving. Had recently obtained his CDL license, like within the last 6 months, and went to apply to work for a specific employer. But the company's insurance policy does not allow drivers under a certain age, and there's a minimum requirement of 2 years for CDL experience. And so they told him that he needed to secure his own insurance, right? So he calls and he says, "Hey, I need to purchase the policy." I was like, "Let me get some information from you. What's the name of your company?" "Well, I don't actually have a company." I said, "Okay, I'm sorry. Explain to me what it is that we're looking to accomplish today." So when he kind of explained that this is what I've been told to do, the difficulty in trying to break down the concept of insurable interest, to a 21-year-old, was interesting. But, I started off the conversation, explained to him that I don't get paid for dissuading people from getting quotes. My job is to absolutely figure out a way to monetize this encounter. However, based on the facts that you just gave to me, you don't have a company, you don't own the equipment, you are an employee from all intents and purposes. There's really not an interest here that we can attach to in order to make this work. It may be that this is just not going to be the job for you. And so walking away, because he was convinced that he needed a quote, and I could have submitted it in a way where we got a rate and we were able to bind a policy. But after I took a little bit of time to understand his true situation, that really wasn't the best thing for us to do. So the monetary motivation is huge when it comes to the agent broker environment. And so that is something that, is top of mind. The next thing that comes up, pretty frequently in terms of the conflict and the challenges to the ethical behavior is conflict avoidance. Sometimes it's easier just to go along and get along. Sometimes rather than being that person who raises their hand, who voices, some pushback, you know, to avoid being the dissenting opinion in the room, which again ties into the need for a culture of ethics. So conflict avoidance, not wanting to be viewed as, a troublemaker or someone who's just going to be a stickler and hard to work with, is a huge factor when it comes to why people don't feel comfortable and empowered to make ethical decisions on a daily basis within an agency environment. And then lastly, time sensitivities, right? So as I mentioned in the earlier scenario, it took for us to have a more involved conversation. We had to do a deeper dive into what the true need was for us to determine that there really wasn't a match in that moment. I could have very easily, because he was adamant, he got on the line, he said, "This is what I need, these are the limits, this is the effective date," and we could have ran with it. It takes time to do that additional due diligence and to dig into a situation and to determine the best course of action. So those are some of the upfront challenges that agents and brokers face on a daily basis that may prevent them from accepting the ethical route to pursue. Any thoughts or comments or feedback as far as that's concerned? Nope. All right, we're moving right along. Um, so I did want to revisit, since I did mention the canons, rules, and guidelines for CPCUs. So typically, when we gather together for all of our major events, we start off with the pledge, right? And we kind of go over and agree and commit to, publicly and as a group, certain behaviors that we're going to exhibit as CPCUs. So I took this snippet from the very front page, and the very bottom is actually the link to the PDF. So obviously, you guys are looking at this on a Zoom, but you can Google CPCU canons and find it pretty easily on the internet. So it talks about, again, in the second paragraph, that these are the minimum standards that are outlined. This is not the end all be all, but this is guidance that is given directly from the society in terms of the expectations as CPCUs. So not only is it given to us as the minimum standards, but then the document goes even deeper and discusses that we are all, in part of becoming a CPCU, we have agreed to be bound by these canons, rules, and guidelines, and that failure to do so, that there are disciplinary actions that back it up. And so this is obviously very specific to, the CPC society and being a designee. But this is also a document that is commonplace in major corporations. You may have some sort of code of conduct, standards in terms of behavior, especially like in the education space. It's not uncommon for educators to, have to adhere to, again, additional behavioral expectations more so than the general public. One of the things I thought was really interesting going through the canons in terms of the guidance that the society gives us is the use of the letter CPCU. So I remember when I first became a CPCU, signed up for membership for the first time, got onto the website and ordered all the swag that I could afford in the moment, right? So I've got the cup, I've got a backpack, an umbrella. Like I think I bought out like the store, right? Because I was super excited about this and I wanted the world to know. And so I had actually looked into, I was like, hey, where else can I, broadcast, my designation? Is that something I can use on social media? Can I get a license plate, So the guidance that's given in the canon, in the second paragraph, talks about what is dignified and professional. So it says, even though the institutes doesn't specify explicitly what's considered dignified and professional, they do state here that they generally apply a very conservative standard. So at that point, cancel the appointment with the tattoo parlor, that probably wouldn't have gone over well and in line with the intention. So again, ethics, in this case, the society has gone that extra step and actually outlined for us something that it would not have been illegal to do, it wouldn't have been immoral to do, but it's just not in line with what's expected from us as CPCUs. So lastly, it's really important to talk about the stakeholders in the ethical behavior for brokers and agents. And so for the most part, there's three major relationships when it comes to the agency and the brokerage. And the first one is the relationship that we have with our carriers, so with the insurance companies. The central relationship, of course, are relationships directly with our customers. And then we also have relationships and expectations in terms of ethics with the regulatory pieces, right? The Department of Insurance and anyone else, to whom you have an obligation and responsibility from a regulatory standpoint. So the core in determining what is ethical behavior, what is ethical communications, with each of these stakeholders, again, goes right back to that concept of what is usual and customary and accepted and expected in each of these relationships. So Tracy, you mentioned again on the carrier side of things that there's a certain rapport and relationship that happens between the carrier and the agency. And so, especially from an underwriting perspective, there is an expectation that submissions that are sent in are going to be complete and accurate. Several years ago, when I was early in career, I wrote a lot of personal lines, and I had a walk-in one day that said, "Hey, I need a renter's insurance policy." Fantastic. Have a seat. Let's kind of walk through, your address. I collected all of the data, read all the questions verbatim from the application. We're at the very end where he was deciding on what mode of payment. He said, "Man, I'm so glad that I was able to get in here and get this taken care of today because I was broken into last week." And I'm like, I'm sorry, say that again. What do you mean you were broken into? So, oh yeah, we were robbed. It was horrible. And so after that, I had this epiphany that I need renter's insurance. And so I went back, right, to the earlier part of the application where it asked, have you sustained a loss within the last 36 months? The question was not, did you file a claim? And so none of this popped up in terms of clue or anything like that, because it was an uninsured loss. I was down to the final page, guys. He had the credit card in hand, right? I mean, if I didn't hear what I heard, it would have been a bind, right? And that's how I get paid. It would have been a commissionable sale. But I had to stop. I had to stop everything. Now, the reality of it is there are no cameras or microphones in my office. I could have very well proceeded and pretended like I didn't hear what he said, but that was a hard stop. And the expectation that our carriers have of us as appointed agents is that we are an extension of the underwriting process. We are the front line of underwriting. So everything that we hear, that we see, does the person appear nervous, all of those indicators of potential for fraud, there is an expectation that we are behaving ethically because, especially with binding authority, what we do in the agent's office is an extension of whatever the carrier's obligations are. Proper description of the risk. So that goes back to, in that scenario, even though what was evident on paper was different than this verbal piece of information I was given, if I did not disclose that, I would not properly be making the carrier aware of what they're potentially getting into. And so this is a huge thing, especially for those who write property coverage, right? Because everyone has kind of been there when you're going through the estimating tools and trying to figure out what the replacement cost is for a property. And most of the time, especially with homeowners with personal lines, that estimate is either going to be higher than what they anticipated or lower. Very rarely is it just spot on what they were told they needed to purchase. And that's a very common misconception with the public, is that this is the amount of my loan, this is the amount of coverage that I'm looking for. And so what agents are tempted to do is to go back into the estimator and to tweak things so that it lines up closer to what it is that the customer is wanting. So there's some pressure here sometimes, and oftentimes there's pressure from management, there may be pressure from the customer, but that pressure, when met with ethical behavior, ethics has to prevail. So again, the expectations are based on what's usual and customary. This may be things that you've actually agreed to contractually. As an independent agent, I represent multiple carriers, and in each of them, their appointment process and their paperwork and their contract with me is slightly different. So we always have to understand that ethical behavior is what undergirds and supports the relationships that we have with the carriers, which is literally what keeps us in business. Have any of you ever experienced, interactions with the agent's office where there were questions in regards to ethical behavior? All right, we will keep moving. And they don't understand the product in and out the way that we do. And so they are relying upon our professional license to give them the guidance that they need to make sure that they are properly covered. So the customer is really vulnerable in this interaction, and they're expecting a clear explanation of the coverage. So if you sell a policy and there is an exclusion, there's an endorsement, modification or limitation of what it appears to be at first glance, it is the ethical duty of the agent to make sure that they walk them through and make sure that the customer goes into this eyes wide open with full knowledge and acceptance of what it does and does not do. Honest pricing. I think that's something that comes up, especially when it comes to renewal activity in the agent's office. Customers oftentimes, if there's a rate increase, maybe it's again a homeowner's policy and there's escrow involved, and now their monthly payment with the mortgage company has increased. And there's temptation, going back to the earlier point, for conflict avoidance to just go in there and scale things back just to fix it, right? And so it's really important that customers understand that with pricing and insurance, just like many other products that we buy, there's going to be a trade in line with what it is you're asking for. So honest pricing and ethics is a big concern in the agent environment. And the last thing is accountability. I hear that more often than not, especially when it comes to complaints, is that, when you were pursuing the business, you guys were super responsive, you answered every call, you're Johnny on the spot. But now that I have a policy in place and I need servicing, there's no one there who's willing to help me. And so making sure that that relationship is one where you again lay out for them and the expectations in terms of what they can expect in the event of an emergency. This is a number to report a loss, things like that, so that customers don't feel where there's an uneven relationship, to where now that they've paid and they're stuck, that they're not getting the value back by even access to that professional that they decided to do business with. So lastly, the third, part of the stool here in this three-part relationship with ethics has to do with the regulatory environment that we're in. It's no secret to any of us that insurance is highly regulated because there's so many areas where fraud is prevalent, and our ability to really live up to the promise has implications to society at large. When insurance companies don't pay, when they go under, that impacts the ability for communities to rebuild, especially after something's happened. So the expectation in terms of ethics obviously starts with compliance. Whatever it is that you're required to do as an agency, whether it's record retention, running reports, disclosures, all of those things, there is an assumption and a reliance on ethical behavior. Because at any given time, the Department of Insurance reserves the rights to, ask for, to audit records, to do site inspections and things like that. So we have to make sure that everything that we do, we're taking the time and we're thorough, because we understand that that's part of that relationship. The responsibility for continuing education. So it's really important that regardless of how long you've been in the industry, that you keep yourself abreast of emerging risks, changes, things that really impact our ability to do our jobs well. Whenever I talk about continuing ed, I always refer back to again the doctor environment. I want to make sure that the doctor that treats me, has been made aware of all the different remedies that are available versus when he came out of med school. Same thing with our customers. They have the right to deal with, informed professionals that are staying on top of their continuing ed and not just, fabricating attendance in classes so that they can submit their license renewal. And lastly, again, it all ties in together, that accurate record keeping, making sure that everything's thorough, labeled, accessible, stored in the manner in which we're required to do. So these are all ethical things that, and this is probably, a big reason why agencies and brokers get shut down and lose their licenses, is because they may or may not have been behaving ethically throughout the course of the year. But when it comes to the regulatory bodies, it's not what you've done, it's what you can prove. And so making sure that we prioritize and treat those relationships as such is really important. So, lastly, again, the tie in between HR and insurance, compliance and culture creating, is that top down is really the only way that a culture of ethics can really take root. So, when the senior leadership, behaves ethically themselves, let's start there. When their decision making is in line with how they told you it would be, when you hear that they prioritize and that the direction of the company is definitely based on a code of ethics or standards that have been pre-established, then it makes it easier for middle line or frontline employees to also, hold that mantle and behave on a day-to-day basis in a way that reflects best on their industry, on their profession, and on the company itself. So that's really, again, in a nutshell, why so specifically in the agent and broker environment, ethics is a core piece of it. That's where trust is established and maintained, and that's just kind of keeps with everything, keeps everything rolling, keeps the relationship. Healthy, so that we can all do what we've come to do, which is really to take care of people, homes, communities, and businesses. So this is my contact information. Kind of did a little weird wraparound. I'm very active on LinkedIn. There's probably not a whole lot of Precious Norman-Waltons out there, so I'm pretty easy to find. If you have doubts, go through Tracy's page and you'll find me there all the time. But that's what I have for you in terms of, the discussion on ethics in the agent and broker environment. Did anyone have any feedback or thoughts in terms of anything that we discussed? You guys have heard me this time, right? I haven't.
Yes, yes. I mean,
Okay, just making sure.
yeah, I think the comment that I would make is that, ethics is one of those. And first of all, thank you for the presentation because it was beautifully laid out and just hit all the notes, that you want to hit when you talk about this topic. But it's just so funny to me that ethics is one of those topics that, we all know, we understand it, but when you look at something that really should be simpler than it is, particularly as CPCUs and professionals, why it is so difficult for some people to resist those impulses to behave in unethical ways.
Agreed.
But, and I
Absolutely.
think you made the point earlier on that, we don't, as an industry, we don't want to trot it out in March and put it away for the other 11 years. It really needs to become ingrained in the fabric of who we are as individuals, but also how we, just how we transact our business. So,
Absolutely. Because that faith and that confidence that things are being done and that I don't have to double check behind how they're being done because I know that my interests are being held high in this transaction, that's going to continue to just add to that confidence level that people have in our industry. Because again, as a recent claimant, I was in a position where I was unsure that I was being dealt with fairly. And, it's because I have so much, skin in the game, if you will, that I knew. I said, this has just got to be a misunderstanding. This can't be malicious because I've been insured at this company for years. I know how this goes. I'm surrounded by talented men and women on a daily basis who do this sort of work. So let me just kind of talk it out a little bit more. But when the general public knows that we are prioritizing and emphasizing ethical behavior, I think it goes a long way as well.
absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So a few notes. The Rhode Island CPCU chapter, traditionally, when our speakers donate their time, as the lovely Precious has, we definitely want to acknowledge that in some way. So we do make charitable donations on their behalf. Precious has chosen an organization called Compassion for Lives. Compassion for Lives is an organization that helps. Um, Reacclimation for people whose lives have been disrupted by things like incarceration, returning veterans, and displaced youth. I sound like that. What's that movie? My cousin Vinny. We was talking about the youths. um, so we will be making a small donation in your name to that organization, and I would
Thank you.
just ask everyone, as you consider your charitable giving throughout the year, to consider this organization. And the other two things I would mention is that we do have a couple of other meetings coming up that you want to mark your calendars for. The first one I'm especially excited about is on March 25th. We have a joint event with the Boston and Central Massachusetts chapters, a virtual magic show. I've seen magic shows, I've seen mentalists, I've never seen it done virtually. It is $20 per person, or I should say $20 per household. So it is a family friendly event. The link is on our page. So if you're not doing anything that evening on March 25th, do join us. It should be super fun. And the other is on April 8th. We have a presentation about resilience and mindfulness. That'll be another lunch and learn session, also on the chapter webpage. And that's really all I've got. Precious, I so appreciate you making time to be with us this afternoon. I found out, unfortunately, that some people were having difficulty accessing the Zoom. So we will be making this recording available to everyone. So no worries. If there was anyone that wanted to attend and was not able to, you're certainly welcome to share the recording with them. We're high tech now. We have a YouTube page, so we'll be uploading it to our YouTube page.
Awesome.
All right. Did anyone else have any other comments or anything they wanted to say before I give you back a few minutes of your afternoon?
Thank you for this presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you guys for having me.
All right. Well, everyone have an excellent and ethical afternoon.